Hello and welcome to Between Two Joels. I'm Joel Armstrong.
And I'm Joel Anderson.
Joel's favorite Mario game of all time is Super Mario World, and his second favorite is Super Mario Bros. 3, whereas my favorite Mario game of all time is Super Mario Bros. 3, and my second favorite is Super Mario World. Very different stuff.
Let's start off with some news. One of the most interesting stories that we have didn't come from OpenAI, Google, or Meta. It came from the Vatican. Pope Leo is reportedly working on a major AI statement focused on human dignity, which really shows how AI is now colliding with religion, philosophy, and questions about what it means to be human.
So this is the Pope in collaboration with one of the co-founders from Anthropic, the collab we've all been waiting for. I mean, this is an interesting exercise. I'm curious to hear what the Pope has to say. I'm not sure what sort of general statements you might make. I do think it's interesting that Anthropic has done a very good job of positioning themselves as sort of the moral compass of the multi-$100 billion companies that want you to use AI for everything all the time.
I think it's great.
Yeah.
Trust stereometry a lot more than Sam Altman.
He does. I'm inclined to agree, though I'm not entirely sure why. But yes, they seem to care a lot about model alignment, prioritize AI safety in a lot of the
that's kind of how
that
Anthropic was started in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, they kind of split. So Derriamade was, I don't know if he was a co-founder, just a very early entrant into OpenAI, but him and some of the other guys that left on the idea that they can build AI safer and more principled and whatnot. And even if you go back to some of the statements that Derriamade said while he was working for OpenAI, he was very vocal about the need for safety and sort of a measured approach without just unleashing everything.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because they are finding that rather than sort of training specific rules in, the alignment works better if you can instill ethics and moral guidelines into the models, because they serve the same purpose in models that they do in humans, which is to provide guidelines to judge behavior against rather than specific sort of, delineated, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do.
Okay, so the next news story that we have, for the past 2 years, the AI competition has mostly been framed as who was the smartest chatbot, but new data suggests that Anthropic has overtaken OpenAI in business adoption for the first time, largely driven by Claude code and enterprise developer tools.
No surprise to me.
No, I mean, I think
Claude's amazing.
Claude is very good. I have switched to Claude as my daily driver. I think like a distinction that's emerged that doesn't necessarily get captured in the sort of model horse race is that like model is just one component. And now something that we're seeing become really, really important is what's called the harness, which is the sort of like control system you have. And it uses the model is the engine, and the harness is sort of the car you build with that engine. And you attach different tools to it and allows you to organize your file systems and to access different stuff and to have sort of a central planning agent and all these sorts of things. And the effectiveness of your harness is like a primary determinant of the quality of the results that you get in a way that's not just dependent on the model anymore. And that's, I think, part of the thing that I've found is like, I don't really care. Like the models are all really, really good. And so jumping back and forth because one gets 2% better rather than having a single workflow that you can get good at and attach tools to and grow with is making a bigger difference over time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why Claude's winning, is because their own researchers are using it for their all the work that they're doing. They joke internally, they're like, no one's writing code. It's all AI written code. And we're just finding better ways to use the AI written code and using AI as part of their processes when they're building their systems.
Totally.
I think the reason Claude is winning now, I mean, you could see the curve for a long time. You see these Claudes skyrocketing and OpenAI still growing, but not as fast. And then finally Claude overtakes. No big surprise because of the trends. ChatGPT kind of had a huge moment out the gate. But then since then, a lot of people have moved. And I think a lot of it is behind the sort of rhetoric from the different companies. People look at OpenAI and they're sort of seen as the villain in some ways. And Anthropic, maybe the sort of up and comer. But now that they're in the lead, I think we'll probably continue to see some oscillation.
So today we're going to be getting right into it with digital twins. Specifically, we're going to be talking about how you measure accuracy when it comes to digital twins, because we spend a lot of time talking about synthetic data
and computing.
And so do all of you, as far as we can tell. I don't know who you are. People are all the time saying, Jules, when are you going to tell us more about synthetic data? And we always have more to say about synthetic data. So we're going to get started talking about accuracy in digital twins. So Joel, you've been doing a lot of work. We've been talking a lot the last couple of weeks about accuracy, particularly in regards to what's sort of like one of the major papers these days in synthetic data and digital twins. So you want to tell us a little bit about that paper to get us started?
Sure, yeah. Synthetic data means a lot of things to a lot of people. So we're specifically talking about replacing people with digital twins of themselves. I mean, not that people are doing it to themselves. We're talking about replacing respondents with digital twins of those same respondents. We collect some data about them and then use that data to extrapolate how they would answer on future surveys, like quantitative surveys.
Yeah. So this synthetic data is individual level, right? You take information about individual people and you simulate those individual responses. So you get similar structured data to how you would if you were running a survey or something like that, where you get rows of data that represent each of these synthetic individuals.
Digital twins as a form of using synthetic data is one of the main ways that people are thinking about as like showing the most promise. So it's the area, when these papers started coming out a couple of years ago or 18 months ago or so, they were the areas that got us pretty excited about. And we started diving into right away and looking at different ways that we could be doing this. People want to think about it as, does it work or not? And it'd be great if the world was black and white, but it is not.
Yeah. And so that's why we've been doing a lot of work on this and a lot of talking about this is we want to be commenting meaningfully on that nuance, saying not just whether it works or not, but how well it works and under what conditions and what it means for it to work and to try and help people understand all of those sort of nuances.
Yeah, that's a big one is like, what does it mean to work? What does it mean if digital twins are effective? Is there utility there? And that's kind of what we'll get into when we talk about accuracy.
Absolutely. So the paper we're going to be focused on today, what's the name of this paper?
Twin 2K 500.
Yes.
And then there's a long
subtitle
after the colon.
Yeah.
This is a good paper because they open sourced and it's by researchers from Columbia University in New York. And it's a great paper because they open sourced the data behind it, what their digital twin said, and what the humans said that they trained it on. And they did it with the best of intentions. So I love it. The other major paper we won't be getting into is a paper by researchers at Stanford University, and they built digital twins too. They seeded it with individual level data, but they did theirs with an interview instead of other quantitative research, but similar idea. But those researchers didn't open source their data, so we can't really talk about it.
So the paper, Twin 2K 500, why don't you tell us quickly what exactly it was at a high level that they did?
The 2K stands for a twin, obviously means they did digital twins. 2K means they have a sample of 2,000 people. They started with, I think, 2,500, but they did 4 waves of surveying. And then the 500 refers to how many questions that they had the data for. So they use the information from waves 1 to 3 when they create the persona behind these people. And it's not just a general persona, like a segment. It's seeded with all their individual level information. So like asking them questions about their demographics, their attitudes, their behaviors, all this different type of stuff that you would get in a survey. They use that information then to ask it follow-up questions to then say, what would you say for this?
Right. So you build out a profile of the individual with a bunch of information about them, demographics, all those sorts of things. You also build out the profile with a bunch of information about how they've answered real questions in the past based on these true individuals, right? And so you have sort of an understanding of this person that you can hand to the LLM, who they are, what they're like, what they believe, what they think about a range of issues. And then you use that sort of seeded persona to get more accurate and individual level responses from the digital twins.
Yeah, that's right. And like part of their paper is to figure out, well, what's the best way to encapsulate all that prior information? Waves 1 to 3, right? So do they just list all the questions and answers, or do they summarize it into a summary, like use AI to reduce all that information and summarize it? Or do they do it in some other formats? Like they tested a bunch of those.
So that's our setup. So we got digital twins. We have a bunch of information about these individuals. They're answering questions that we have, real data from for decades. And so what are sort of the headline findings of the paper?
The main headline finding of the paper was they had 88% relative accuracy. And obviously when you hear that, you go, wow, it's like amazing.
Yeah, that's been a big thing, right? Like that people have heard about this paper. This has gained a lot of traction in the field when it comes to like how accurate do we actually think synthetic data can be because of this headline number. And so we're going to get specifically into an aspect of this, which is what exactly does that 88% mean?
There's many ways that you can calculate accuracy. The two sort of broad ways would be, did they say the same thing or not? If you have a 7-point scale, let's say it's some sort of, anchored scale on either end. So you strongly like something and strongly dislike something on the other end. If it's exact, like an exact match, accuracy would be, did they get a 4 on each? Did they get a 7 on each, etc. The downside of that is that if you get close, then it's penalized the same as if you got really far away.
Right. So the base version, this first simplest version would be, is it exactly the right answer?
Yeah.
You'd have a 1 if it's accurate and a 0 if it's not, and then you'd tally up basically the percentage of ones.
Yeah. And if it's a 7-point scale, then you'd have 1 in 7 chance of getting that accurate if it's evenly distributed across the prior probabilities across all of the options in the scale.
Right. But that doesn't account for the fact that answering close to right is better than answering way away from right. So if you have that 7-point scale, what's next on the sort of list of things you could
do? The accuracy measure that they used, the formula is 1 minus the distance between the predicted value and the actual value divided by the range of options in the scale. So if you're on the 7-point scale, if you had a 1 versus a 7, then you're 6 apart. So you're the maximum distance, and then you divide by the range of options. So 7 minus 1 options in the scale is 6 options in the scale. So 6 over 6 is 1. And then you'd have 1 minus 1, so you'd have 0 accuracy in that case. But if you were a perfect hit, if your answer was 7 and the prediction was 7, then you'd have 7 minus 7, is 0, divided by the range of 6 is 0. So then you have equals 100, because you do 1 minus that value. You'd have 100% accuracy for that exact match.
Right. So if your correct answer was a 7 and you got a 6, you're off by 1, which is 1/6 of the possible gap.
Yeah.
So you've got like an 84% accuracy.
Exactly.
And that's basically the scale we're talking about. You get credit for being close, and you get penalized more for being far away.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, one thing that's important to understand when it comes to this 88% headline metric, what does relative mean? And so the way that they did this, right, is that they assumed there was a ceiling on how accurate a result they could get. And they used what you would call test-retest reliability, which is the fact that when you have someone take a test twice, they won't answer the questions exactly the same. If you got someone to rate a product right now, and a week later, they would be roughly 80% similar in the way they would answer your large battery of questions, right? So it's really not reasonable to expect that a set of synthetic individuals would be more than 80% the same in their answers, because humans aren't even 80% the same to themselves when you get them to answer multiple times. Now, equally interesting is the question of how you set a floor, because the same way that you kind of bring down the maximum reasonable expectation for what can be achieved, you also need some way of knowing what the minimum bar that you can cross for it to be meaningful. And so we would call that like a naive baseline, right? If you have this 1 in 6 die, you know that there's a 1 in 6 chance of guessing correctly what face is going to be up, right? So it doesn't matter what your predictive method is, it needs to do better than random guessing. And random guessing means you get it right 1/6 of the time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They assumed that there was an even chance for any of those options to be selected for any question. So it's called a uniform distribution. For calculating a random baseline, they used a random uniform distribution. It's kind of the lowest possible bar that you could have for this. I would argue that it's not really a great random baseline.
And so what you mean by uniform distribution for this, what they did is they took, say it was a 7-point scale, they randomly selected from 1 to 7, and they assumed any of those numbers were equally likely to have been the answer that was given.
Yeah, that's right. But we just know from doing many surveys over the years that people don't pick the ends of the scale as often as they pick the middle of the scale. People sort of generally hedge, and people are more likely to say somewhat agree than strongly agree.
And what this kind of points to that's pretty interesting and maybe not as intuitive when we were talking about the die example is that when you're doing predictive models, there's no single correct thing to choose as your naive baseline. You get to think through it and choose what you think would be the most reasonable way of saying we should perform to at least this level, and what you choose will impact the way you interpret your results.
Yeah. Exactly. So if you use their version, equal chance of all options on the scale, then the naive baseline, if you do all the math, and they did it all, I verified it too, then you get 59%. That's your baseline accuracy, which is kind of an unintuitive number, but it is mathematically correct. But the choice is subjective about what to use for the random baseline. So they calculated 59% to be random chance. I did the math. If you just, instead of using a random baseline, if you use the midpoint every time, then you actually have a 68% chance.
So we know from a lot of historical market research and just surveys in general that people's answers are not randomly distributed across all 7 points on a 7-point scale or all 5 points on a 5-point scale as a naive baseline, so that we can make sort of a more informed decision trying to figure out what do these numbers actually mean. So we were looking at a particular chart that shows sort of from 0 to 100% how much of an answer can be reasonably accounted for by including all the sort of sources of information that contribute to that. And on that 100% bar, we brought the ceiling down from 100% to 82% in line with what we were talking about. And we know that the floor was starting out at 59% based on the uniform distribution method, but we didn't think that was very appropriate. So we were trying to figure out where we'd actually kind of squeeze those bars for us to sort of agree with the interpretation. One of the things that we came up with as a simple naive baseline was just the idea of the mode, right? The most common answer that you already got. So if you just apply the mode, how accurate do you get is the question we were asking. And you ran the simulations on that. And what do we find with that?
Yeah. So when we calculate that out, then it becomes 75% accurate, which is funny because their digital twins were 71.7% accurate.
Right. So this is kind of like a pretty big deal when it comes to interpreting the value of these digital twins.
Yeah, it's pretty stark. We were trying to figure out, well, where is this proper ceiling? 59 seems a little low. 68 was what we got if we just used the midpoint. So that was a pretty reasonable candidate. If we're showing that the digital twins only had a sliver of value, it helps you understand sort of the mechanics of the math behind this and what does it mean to calculate accuracy in this way. What we found is that using the mode actually had a higher accuracy at the individual level for predicting everybody. So what that means is most of the variation on balance, because the mode had higher predictive accuracy at the individual level than the digital twins did, that suggests that the balance of the variation that we see in this data set was due to either noise or bias or whatever. It's just saying that you do digital twins with all this individual information because that individual information helps us extrapolate and really know, based on prior answers, what they would say in the future. And what this is telling us is that you throw all that away and you get better results if you just use the one number that everyone says.
Right. And so the whole point of digital twins is to try and use as detailed of information as you can at the individual level to make sure that what's getting predicted meaningfully differs between individuals, right? That you're capturing individual level information. And what we found is that it is not capturing or representing individual level information, or if it is doing so, it is doing so in a way that does not meaningfully capture useful information. It turns out that if you're asking a question of these digital twins, the better answer to that question is going to be just what was the most common answer
for everybody
from your training data for every single person.
Yeah. And then the obvious follow-up to that is that means that everyone has the same answer. So all subgroup analysis is the same.
Right.
Zero variance in your data set.
Can't do any subgroup analysis.
You can't even really interpret anything because your results are 100% on the most common thing.
Right.
The point is, you would never actually do this. We're just highlighting that a very naive version of understanding what's the incremental value that this individual level information is providing to you. And we're saying that it's actually a net negative instead of a net positive versus another very naive way of doing this.
Right. And so this is kind of a big deal because we want to be clear. We are not anti-synthetic data. We're very pro-synthetic data. We're super interested in it. We think that AI is a fundamentally fascinating mechanism for capturing large-scale information, for compressing just trillions of words of knowledge. There's something really important and interesting happening here. And we're trying to figure out what that is. But this is one of the strongest pieces of evidence we'd seen so far. We kind of reached the conclusion that this will not help us achieve any sort of meaningful synthetic data or digital twin service or offering or anything like that. We cannot use this in a meaningful way.
Yeah, this shows us, at least for this methodology and this data set, this is not doing it.
Yeah. And to reiterate your point, kudos to the researchers. They did a good job. We're not saying that this is bad research. We're saying that
definitely not.
It's important to really dig into things because this stuff is complicated and nuanced.
Now we're going to move to our last little fun section. We're going to do kind of a trivia. So I've got a quote. And then I've got a list of what the quote could be about. And you have to guess which one it is, okay? The first one is, this technology may weaken human intelligence and memory. Is it about calculators, AI, television, telephones, or internet?
I'm going to go with television.
I'm going with calculators.
Good one. It's about calculators.
Nice.
This is from the 1970s.
Yes. I love this subgenre of commentary, the 1890s newspaper quotes about no one will talk to each other anymore because we'll all be reading our own papers.
Or books come out and they're no one's going to think for themselves because they're all going to have the same idea.
Yeah.
People will lose the ability to think for themselves. Is this about calculators, AI, television, telephones, or?
I'm doubling down on television.
I'm going with internet. I think you're right.
AI.
AI.
Nah.
I mean, that one did make sense. It's like there's a trick question to it, so you don't want to go with the obvious answer.
Children exposed to this too often may struggle socially.
Television. He's got to be right one of these times.
Social media is under like internet.
Okay, I'm going internet.
We have different strategies.
Television.
Yeah, good old rock. Nothing beats rock.
This technology could destroy entire industries and eliminate creative jobs.
I'll go with AI on this one. I don't know why I said it like that, but
I'm going AI.
You guys are right.
Nice.
This invention will ruin meaningful conversation.
The telephone.
Yeah, that one's from the 1880s.
Wow.
Workers fear they'll become obsolete because of automation.
Seems like an AI one as well.
This one's a trick question, the Industrial Revolution.
That was a trick question.
Back to my social media, off script.
Yeah, I didn't know we were supposed to just be making up answers the whole time.
Yeah.
All right, so we got pretty deep into the weeds with a little bit of digital twins today, but this is not the last time we'll be talking about synthetic data. We've got a couple more topics on the list we're excited to be talking about soon. But in the meantime, thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Bye.